Hi there, everyone. 1 o'clock on the West Coast. Good afternoon. Welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We are live. We are interactive. We'll talk about that in just a second. I'm ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications, Naj Alakan. To my right, my colleague, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations, Edgar Zaswata. Edgar, how are you today?
Good. One of these days I'll see you in person, but until then, I'm glad to be able to see you on camera once a week.
I know it. You know what? I was thinking about this today. It's been so long since we have all seen each other, and you and I spend more time being able to talk to each other here than we have been able to anywhere else.
Yeah, no. So I mean, that's where we have to be thankful for technology, right? As I'm sure we're all experiencing Zoom overloads or WebEx or whatever. But it is good to have the platform to connect with you and also to connect with a lot of our members and other folks who have been loyally chiming in and getting on every week. So thankful for the opportunity.
Well, that leads us right into the live and interactive. We are live, so you never know what is going to happen. We are interactive. We welcome your comments and your questions over in our comment section. Edgar and I can see those coming in as we speak throughout the show. If we have answers to your questions, we'll definitely be able to provide those to you. And we want your comments. We want you to say hello. We have some loyal viewers out there that we do appreciate you participating and coming back every week. That includes Lisa Salas Brown, who gave us a question near the end of last week's show. Lisa, we've brought an expert on to answer your question today. So Lisa, if you're out there, definitely let us know. We'd love to have you say hello to us, and all of you say hello to us and pass along your questions and your comments. We've had a very busy week here in Sacramento. The legislature, Edgar, came to agreement on their side of the budget. They've moved it over to the governor's side. That was Monday in the 6 o'clock hour. We sent out an analysis to all members around 6:30 with some of the bullet points. And I do want to just go through those really quickly before we dive into the state budget, because that's really the focus today. As far as agreements based on a federal relief package, we have LCFF would receive 2.3% COLA. All categorical programs, including adult ed and CTE, would be fully funded. $5.3 billion in deferrals. That would be for 1920 and for 2021. And then the reallocation of $2.3 billion in non-Prop 98 funds to buy down STRS and PERS. Okay, so those are the agreements. Now, if there's no federal relief, we've got a different story. We've got some disagreements here on cuts versus deferrals, timing of triggers, special ed, allocations of federal funds for learning loss, ADA hold harmless, instructional minutes. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, Edgar, based on what comes from the federal government. What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, I had to say that we did not pay Mohammed to give us those comments, but we're very appreciative about the lower viewers and giving us the feedback. So we appreciate that. Naj, to your question, I think, as you said, and I think the key point, and we'll hear from one of our partners and experts here in a second, who'll give a little bit more of the flavor of what we're hearing here in the Capitol. But I think the biggest piece is, yes, legislature passed the budget earlier this week. That's not going to be the end all. That's not the piece that folks are going to be able to rely on, that some of these negotiations are ongoing, even though the legislature passed their version. And we always run the risk here, every time we do something live, of saying something, because you're going to be able to have a chance to see, no, you guys were wrong, and we heard you say that a few hours ago. But I'm going to say it, the best intel we're hearing is that they are close, if not, that there'll be an announcement of some kind on a budget deal, probably today. And again, this will be recorded, and some people may see this later in the day and say, well, it's today and we haven't heard anything. So I'll give that caveat. And I think the big picture there is, as we've been reiterating for the last couple of weeks, is that the advocacy has been working. The advocacy has been working. Our folks talking about that they simply couldn't open up schools safely, effectively, to provide programs with the amount of cuts that was initially proposed I think it's made a difference, and the policymakers have definitely moved. We don't know every final detail, but I think it's safe to say that we are going to see a shift from where the conversation started just weeks ago to now ending up in a different place. The caveat obviously is the need is never going to be completely met. We were already hurting as a system even prior to COVID, and there's not anything that fundamentally is going to change that. But I think us picking our battles and really seeing that to the extent that we were able to move the policymakers, I think there will be some good news. We're never done here. There's going to be a lot that we're going to have to continue to fight for, and to give some reality checks to the policymakers about what it is the field is dealing with. But all told, feeling at least relatively optimistic and positive about the developments.
All right. Well, we bring on live guests onto our show, and we don't, we don't bring in just nobodies here. The president partner of Capital Advisors, ACSA friend, the legendary Kevin Gordon, is with us today to talk about the state budget and what is taking place over there. Kevin, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Good to be with you guys. Really well.
Kevin, so what's the latest? I mean, talk to us a little bit about what happens during these days between the legislature and the governor and what you're hearing right now.
Right. Well, starting last weekend, just following the legislature's action in sort of getting the agreement made between the two houses that were going to go forward without the governor, they actually started in earnest with negotiations with the governor. And what we know is during the weekend, things started out really very well. I think they definitely had some rough patches, but we are hearing, as it was acknowledged by Edgar, that they've got pretty much an agreement in outline at least, and that agreement is something that we're going to hear more about hopefully today. What we're anticipating is a no-cut budget to K-12 education. Some of the pieces that are not answered yet that we don't know about, that are still probably the subject of negotiation, which would be what is the status of the COLA, and then also getting an answer on exactly how a hold harmless would work. Some of the really big questions that a lot of folks in the field are really anxious to get answers to. So we are still awaiting some of that, but it's looking good for, I think, some bipartisan agreement, certainly two-house agreement with the governor, that I think we're going to hear more about later. One of the adages that you guys are used to hearing all the time over the years is that governors always win. And the dynamics are a little bit different this time around because you have just a lot of different things going on. You have an election year for, all of the state assembly, half of the state Senate. You've got overwhelming majorities in both houses that give them the power to do a veto override if they ever did it. It's very rarely used, and governors want to avoid having a veto override ever even threatened, but it's not lost on the governor that they do have the votes for that. So there's a real incentive for the governor to work with this legislature. And then the legislature knows and is acutely aware of the governor's incredibly high polling numbers that just were released a week and a half ago from PPIC that have him up in the 70% range. That means it's not somebody you want to tangle with without obviously hurting yourself in an election year. So all of these dynamics really serve to bring the parties together. And what we'll see is there's going to be wins on both sides, and there are going to be some real compromises on both sides in order to make this work. But for education, I think our hopes all along have been that the governor would come closer to where the legislature is at rather than the reverse. And I think we're going to end up seeing something like that.
Kevin, one of the questions we've been getting a lot from our members, and I know you from your clients over the last month or so, is all of these tools that are going to be necessary in order for schools to reopen, whether it be some flexibility on instructional minutes, rethinking ADA, the question about how do we ensure compliance around issues like special education and things that the traditional system usually just they're givens, but now given a lot of the models that we're thinking about, what's your take on where the legislature? Obviously, this has been a point of consideration. In some cases, there's been some debate. But what's the latest thing you're hearing on some of these issues?
Yeah, well, there's no question that there's There's definitely a sensitivity in the legislature and in the governor's office about our ability to serve all kids, and particularly those kids that would otherwise, we have seen just from the data, have managed to slip through the cracks a little bit during this shutdown of the physical buildings and our incredibly steep ramp up for distance learning that still has huge gaps in it because California has never invested in terms of technology on a per pupil basis, what honestly a whole lot of other states have done, even though we're the home of all the technological innovation, not just in this country, but globally. It's kind of a shame. But we're in a situation where we're making these big investments and we're ramping up quickly. So I think one of the things that the legislature heard that's connected to your question, Edgar, is the common refrain over and over again, and partly led by really great advocacy on ACSA's part, which is do not expect us to be able to really manage of bringing kids along and going back into a fall opening up of schools in a COVID environment, and you cutting school districts' budget with the biggest cuts we've ever had in a single year in state history. You just can't do that. And if you're deciding to reopen and invest in the kids that you think have been harmed by this, then you need to fund public education. And I think that's what's driving the budget solutions you're about to see. It is a crucial issue relative to the COLA. If we do get a COLA, even if we get flat funding, but especially if we get a COLA on top of the base that we have in the current fiscal year, look for there to be language that's pretty tough in its expectations that we are going to do everything we can to reach out and meet the needs of kids with disabilities and the student populations that have fallen behind. And in many cases, those are kids in poverty. Those are kids of color. Those are kids that are also identified as English language learners. So all of those particular categories, we're going to be the burden of paying special attention to.
Hey, Kevin, let me ask you a question really quickly. This is coming from our former president, Holly Eads. She says, realizing there are still details to work out and you aren't actually in the room, do you anticipate this no cuts budget will include any additional deferrals? I know that there's still information going back and forth, right. Still a lot of negotiations happening.
It's a really good question.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because yes, I think what we end up getting is that the governor wins on his approach to the budget, which is that he's proposed triggering off cuts and maneuvers that give them fiscal flexibility. He would trigger those off if we get federal money. The good news is that for us in education, a no cut budget would happen irrespective of what happens with federal dollars. But the part that we get clipped by, if indeed federal dollars do not materialize, is very large deferrals. So we know that's a $1.9 billion deferral that is going to take place this month. And then we would get funding within the first 15 days of July approximately, that then you would use to pay for obligations in the current month. But those monies would be coming out of next year. And then next year's budget, and this is basically a done deal, would have another $3.4 billion of deferrals. Well, in the compromise, you can expect at least $5 to $6 billion more on top of those other two deferrals that we would see next year if federal funds do not materialize. So yeah, deferrals are a big part of it. And then to return again to your question, Edgar, about the idea of flexibilities, there are going to be a number of flexibilities that ACSA has already reported on that are included in the budget package that the legislature passed. And I think most of those would be inclusive in this agreement. But there are a number of other items that are either going to be addressed in addition to it or are going to be leftover issues that we're going to have to clean up in the coming weeks after a budget agreement is reached. We're going to be still working on, I think, a number of things that we in the education community, but ACSA in particular, has made a big deal about that we need in order to run schools in a COVID and post-COVID environment.
Kevin, we had a question about an issue I know you guys work a lot on, which is nutrition services. Before we get to that question, one comment, and I know you have some thoughts on this, that we hear a lot of debate, even in a more positive budget coming from the Capitol, that they're going to try to keep us harmless, and the hold schools harmless. And I know that's always a dangerous way and for us to even describe it, because what we hear from our members, well, that doesn't take into account, even if we're getting similar amount of money that we did last year, there was all the things that folks had to do this spring to respond to COVID, not to mention the new normal, as we call it, moving into the fall. So just thoughts on just the perspective in terms of what's happened in the Capitol, of this perspective of like, oh, we're giving you the money, so you guys are good, right? And nutrition services, and in that context, you could comment on that, because that's obviously one of the big pieces that folks had to meet the moment, as the governor likes to say, right, in terms of feeding our families and taking care of our communities. Yeah, no, super good point. We know there's a lot of politics about the whole issue regarding hold harmless. And it's not just a simple issue about the basic funding structure, but the idea that I think some legislators came away with the idea that the governor, with his executive order that did invoke that hold harmless for the last couple of months of the school year, that we sort of had a blank check, irrespective of how many kids we were actually engaging. So as we go forward, the legislature, you can look for language for sure that's going to require a certain minimum level of engagement that we're going to have, but a recognition that ADA as a funding device isn't workable. We know that the vast majority of school districts are going to use some kind of blended model. They're going to be using distance learning as they open up again to some extent, some more than others, and that simply is not accommodated in an ADA funding model. So that is a given, that we move to some kind of a hold harmless. The question is, what kind of requirements are going to be there about student engagement, and what kind of evidence will we as school agency have to produce to show, in fact, that we're in fact engaging with students every single day? And that's really what's, I think, we're going to be looking for immediately in the details of any agreement, is what are the nuances of that. Relative to the nutrition issue, both Edgar and I were on the phone with the assistant secretary, actually the deputy secretary of agriculture back in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that's really important for everybody that's listening to know is that, ACSA and our group at Capital Advisors, we all sort of subscribe to the idea that you don't wait till somebody else gets the job done. We know there's national associations out there that are talking to folks in Washington, D.C., but this state, as big as it is, and the diverse needs that we have across our districts, we really have the obligation to be putting pressure on that system to respond to our needs. So we were on the phone with the Deputy Secretary, Brandon Lips, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture very early on, outlining the kind of waivers and relief that we needed in public schools. And very quickly, we ended up seeing a really important give on the behalf of the Trump administration on all of those issues that we had raised. The one issue that was outstanding was the funding issue. And we knew that whether by the legislature or at the federal level, we needed to make sure that we had some of the funding to backfill these increased costs that we have. Fortunately, if you take a look at this agreement and the agreement that the two houses of the legislature put together, there was an augmentation specifically to carry us through on our school nutrition programs all the way through the summer. One of the very last conversations we had with USDA, as we kept checking in with them on different kinds of relief that we were still waiting for, was the idea that even if we can get through summer school for those that are running any kind of a summer school, or the period covered by a summer school in terms of meal distribution and waivers from federal regulations that would otherwise tie our hands on that, we asked for them to look at that gap of time between when summer school would normally be over and, in fact, when schools start in August and late into the month. So they actually came back and said yes. And you may have seen this, that was announced just last week, that we're going to be covered all the way through the summer, which is really good news. And then you'll note that appropriation that's in the two-house agreement that was passed by the legislature. We expect that to be in the governor's package as well.
Hey, Kevin, I know that there are still a lot of nuts and bolts with this. There's still a lot of movement back and forth. We do have a question that's coming from Melissa Simpson Williamson about early education funding. Obviously, a lot of things happening, but are you hearing any updates regarding that early education funding at this point?
No, there are a lot of issues that are still not completely not answered yet, but we know that the disposition of the speaker in particular, having, been a leader on the issue of early education, it's where he came from before he even ran for the legislature. And the governor has made repeatedly early education a major priority. We're expecting that we will get some of the relief relative to waivers that were done by executive order extended by the legislature, as well as better treatment in the budget than we would have seen otherwise as a result of the two-house agreement with the governor that we're going to see. So I think it's going to be good news all around for the kids that we're serving, either our younger kids or the kids that are straight up in the K-12 system. I think we're going to be looking at good news. And what Edgar said is really important, which is that, we're getting pretty clear signals from folks with a good deal of influence over the Capitol building, but things do change. I doubt that they're going to change a whole lot. And then there is a lot of information we don't have the detail on, and we're going to get more of that, in the hours and the days to come. So we're just really excited about the potential that there could be agreement between all the parties now. You will read in several different parts of the press. There's 2 accounts today. Both of them predict we don't have a budget until August or later. And I was looking at those, trying to figure out who they're talking to, because their rationale is good, which is that we're not going to have information on budgets and revenue until July 15th, when they open up what income tax is paid and certain revenues by very wealthy taxpayers in terms of quarterly income taxes. We're going to get all that data not till July 15th. But I think the legislature is in a mood to get this over with, and they do have a sort of the worst case scenario kind of backup plan that I think is sensible and certainly is one that we're going to try to rely upon.
Kevin, we got another question about an issue that we've talked a lot about over the last couple of weeks, which is the guidance and the array of guidance that came out. California Department of Public Health, CDE, California Department of Education, CDC has its own. Pretty much every organization has put out some kind of guide, ACSA included, trying to help our members on this front, but still a lot of confusion in terms of just where does the buck stop, right? Where does this who should we be listening to? And I know we both worked on part of this and tried to partner with the different entities. I'll just say my piece, and then you give your perspective, that especially with the CDE, and I know some people had sticker shock of like, there's 60 pages of guidance here. And for better or for worse, I think the key there is that it's their guidance, it's recommendations. I know that makes it hard, especially because there becomes an expectation that these are some of the things we may do. But there is a lot of considerations there about how do you make the 6 feet work? Is there going to be limitations? What are going to be the impacts in terms of collective bargaining, given that there was some language in there about encouraging folks to come quickly to MOUs or issues around leave? I mean, what's your perspective? I know you're probably getting a lot of these questions from
Well, one of the things that's admirable about our state superintendent is that he really is a big believer in direct engagement with districts. And he's demonstrated that by, truly direct engagement. His cell phone is known by more people than either you or I would care to have our own. And I know he engages with you constantly, Edgar. He's managed to pull you into leadership at several levels over there, but just tireless efforts to work on this issue. And I think one of the things it's important not to sort of mistake with this guidance is that somehow the superintendent or the department are talking down to districts. They know that there's a high level of competence across districts, and you guys got this thing handled. This guidance is really important for districts that are struggling, and it gives them sort of a beginning point of covering the landscape. The reason why it's so long is because it is very thorough about covering a lot of topics. It doesn't have all the answers, but it's a beginning point for some districts that are just beginning to try to figure this all out. Remember that we've got an overwhelming majority of our districts are small, and they don't have extensive staffs to be working on and thinking through every one of the nuances of these issues. I think it was said the other day, and I think it was in the hearing on reopening yesterday, that by the chair of your superintendency committee, Katie McNamara, who represented ACSA really well and talked about the myriad of steps that are just in the decisions that are made before the kid ever enters a classroom. So it's the getting the kid from their home into the school and into school safely before you ever start instruction, all the steps that you got to take. So there's a lot in there, but I will tell you this, the toughest decisions that will be made by you guys locally, by superintendents and boards. You're going to have to make the toughest decisions. The charm of local control does not elude us. Is many times we ask for it, or we're going to get it big time, particularly when the decisions are really tough or potentially controversial. Unfortunately, you're the one that gets to make that. The state's not going to do it for you. So a lot of guidance. We should be thankful that there's not a lot of mandates, which we see in a lot of other states, unreasonable mandates that have high expectations. There are expectations in this guidance that sometimes are a little unreasonable, not real practical in terms of how things are working on the ground. But again, the beauty of it is their guidelines. And so I think there's a lot of good in the effort that was put out. It was certainly a really extensive document, but I think that, districts are going to have to figure out now going forward, find their way. Let me tell you the greatest thing that I thought when I looked at that guidance. The greatest thing that happened with that guidance is it set out a course of options that there was no way for us to be able to do if we don't have a hold harmless on ADA and we don't get some extra funding out of the legislature. And the superintendent has said it repeatedly. I honestly think that practical guidance about how we would begin to reopen has been a driver in illustrating very clearly to both houses of the legislature and the governor that you cannot expect us to reopen and do anything right by our kids and be cutting us the way the May revision had proposed to cut us. And I think in part we have this guidance, the work done on the guidance, to credit for legislators going into this with eyes wide open.
You know what, Kevin, we've got two federal questions, and then we'll let you get back to some important work here. Holly Eads again with another question, which is a really good one. What's the latest information on the federal level with potential relief for states and school districts? What are we hearing? Because there's so much as far as the agreements and disagreements right now that hinges on that federal funding.
Well, I mean, the good news is that Republicans and the president do want some things. And the minute you know that there are expectations they have for another round of stimulus, even though some of it's aimed at business and corporate liability issues, some of it's aimed at actual stimulus that goes out again to businesses and others, taxpayers, and it doesn't hit necessarily states or schools. Them wanting another package begins the opportunity for a compromise to be struck so that we get some kind of a package that aims at some of the things we care about. One of the things I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks is that we shouldn't get overly focused on the president's basic position against state bailouts or Congress's, the U.S. Senate's disposition relative to the HEROES Act, which kind of hit a brick wall. What we should focus on some of the things and the signals that we're getting of places they would like to invest. And one of those we think is in education. So you guys may know that over 100 members of the House of Representatives signed a letter asking for a package that was in excess of $300 billion. We know that the Council of Great City Schools put in a proposal that was supported by ACSA and others. There was $175 billion. Any of these packages, ironically, that help schools is going to help the state of California and our schools disproportionately more than it will the rest of the nation. And the reason why is California, we're more dependent on the state of California for education funding than almost any other state is in its state school district relationship. So if we get a decent package that even if it's only education focused, which I don't expect it to be, I actually expect there to be some state and local support in there as well, that a combination of those things, I think, gets us over the very modest expectations in this budget, a $14 billion envisioning of funds that would help trigger off some of the other cuts that we would always see. If we get that federal aid, it means that we don't do the bigger deferral. There are a lot of reasons for us to be in favor of more federal action. I'm an optimist. I think we're going to see something, and I think it's going to be really, really positive in terms of what the rest of our school year will look like in the coming year.
All right, Kevin, here comes the most important question you are going to answer today.
Very good.
Most important. Edgar has told me, because you guys have been to DC before, Edgar tells me that you are an incredible tour guide when you're in Washington, D.C. That being said, what is the most unique souvenir that you have ever brought back from one of your tours in D.C.?
Boy, that's a tough one. Would that be purchased or stolen?
I had a feeling he was going to go there.
So probably the most unique one would be that a lot of people don't know this, but in the White House, there's this famous swimming pool that JFK used to swim in with some special invited guests. Well, that pool, they built the press room that everybody sees today. They built it over the swimming pool. And Holly, your past president, knows what I'm talking about because I think she's actually been down there. There's this secure door that you can't go into that room. The pool is still there. So you go behind the press briefing room and there's a little staircase that goes down there and you're in the pool. And in the pool are racks of servers that serve the West Wing. So that's why they don't let just anybody down there. Well, the first time I went down there, I realized on the walls are scrawled inscriptions and signatures of many famous people that have sort of inscribed things on the wall there for the last many decades, a bunch of famous names. So I made sure that the next time I went, I took a Sharpie with me. And Edgar, I think you did that with me as well. So we went down we got authorization, we go down into the pool, and bigger than probably any other name that's on the wall, you'll now find, if you get in there, you'll see my name scrawled on the wall. That Sharpie pen that Edgar and I used to sign the wall of the pool at the White House is here in my office. So that would probably be my best trinket that I brought back from DC.
I like that. All right. Kevin Gordon is the president and partner at Capital Advisors. Kevin, it's a busy day, busy week over here in Sacramento. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, and thanks for all the advocacy you guys have done. It's clearly made a difference.
That's good. That's good. Thanks, Kevin, so much. I want to remind you guys, Edgar, as we move past just the bottom of the hour here, we're here every Wednesday. This is live. This is interactive. As you've seen, questions have been coming in throughout this process that we were able to get to Kevin. And we will always bring you the latest information that we can on governmental relations and from the legislature. Edgar, I would think you think that there's going to be something happening today. Could be any time in the next 36, 48 hours, but there's something coming.
It's a fluid situation, and yeah, like you said, we're going to be here every week. We've been lucky to have some great guests. My son, I have to say, because I know some people are asking me that, he was about to make an appearance, but at the risk of getting us censored and not coming back on the air, he had a little accident at the bathroom. I was a little scared of him walking in with no pants on. So I told him maybe this is not the week to come on board, but he sends his best to everybody.
You know, our broadcast standards here on the internet are a little bit different than those put out there by the FCC. But hey, you know what? Maybe next week we'll have something fun just like that. All right, folks, thanks so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Again, we are here every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, live and interactive, to bring you the latest information from the state capitol. Edgar, thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll see you next week.
Good seeing you, Nash.
All right, thanks, folks. Have a great day.